Okay, well, good afternoon, Panam Da, everyone. Based on my watch, it's just turned 1 o'clock, so we'll make a start on this afternoon's webinar. Thank you so much for all of you that have joined us today. Appreciate all of you for giving up your time to hear what I think is a really fascinating piece of work that Wendy's been working on for us at the Bevan Foundation. Just before I hand over to Wendy, just by way of introduction of the Bevan Foundation, for those of you who are not familiar with us, Bevan Foundation is Wales' most influential think tank. We work to find long-term solutions to poverty and inequality. And the work that we'll be presenting on today comes out of a piece of work that's been funded by the Nationwide Foundation, which has enabled us to look at some new data around taxation and housing in Wales, which we think provides some really interesting insights into understanding Wales's housing market and potentially signpost some ways that we might be able to think about housing differently and the different levers that we might have at our disposal to make housing work for everyone. I'm Stefan Evans. I'm the CEO of the Bevan Foundation, so I'll be chairing today's discussion. And I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Wendy, who's done all the hard work on this report and is going to talk you through all her findings. So, Wendy, over to you.
Thank you, Stefan. That's really good. So yes, we've put our new report online this morning. So understanding how taxes on land and property are used in Wales. And it builds on a load of housing work that we're doing at the moment and we've been doing for the last couple of years or so, looking in the area of social homes, getting people out of temporary accommodation. Our last report that Nationwide funded for us was actually looking at faith-owned spaces and how those could be used as affordable homes. So we're almost building a library of knowledge around the housing market and affordability and access for people. I'm going to talk you vaguely through the report structure. I'm not going to include everything because there's a huge amount of detail in there and it gets very statty and I will say housing geeky in a way. So I'm going to try and keep it at a certain level that I don't completely bombard you with lots of charts and lots of figures, but hopefully give you enough to take away and also to go and find more in the report. So just to give you an idea of the detail that is in the report. So I'm going to set the context. The main taxes that the report looks at is land transaction tax and council tax premiums. So I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. And then I'll talk about some analysis we've done of the data, which tells us different things about the housing system, and then just give you some conclusions. To set the context, we kind of took a step backwards, just to start thinking about at what point you may have to pay tax when it comes to property ownership, occupying a property, selling or passing it on, or even developing it. Because we probably hear of these terms, but it just felt like a useful place to kind of start mapping that out. Also to think about who is actually charging that tax or who that income goes to. So anything that is kind of around personal income tax will go to the UK government and HMRC. Since Welsh Government and devolution, there are certain taxes that Welsh Government now have the power to collect through the Welsh Revenue Authority. And then we also have taxes at a local level through local government. And you'll see there that the ones that we're focusing on today around council tax and also land transaction tax sit in that tax of occupying property and also purchasing property. So take you into land transaction tax. I'm going to start from the very beginning because if you haven't bought a property for a while, then you're probably not as familiar with land transaction tax as you might be. You may be more familiar with the term stamp duty. So we had stamp duty. Stamp duty is still in place in England and Northern Ireland. However, land transaction tax was the Welsh equivalent, or is the Welsh equivalent of stamp duty. And it was the first Welsh tax to be put in place once we had those devolved powers to create our own Welsh taxes. So actually the first Welsh tax to be charged in almost 800 years. It's payable at the point that somebody purchases a property. Now, the data talks about transactions. The transactions are actually purchases, if we think of it in that way, to keep things simple. And there is a main rate of transaction tax, but also a higher rate. The higher rate being charged when the person already owns a property. So they are buying a second property, either for their own occupation on a part-time basis, or perhaps as a landlord buying a property as a buy-to-let. I've put the main bands there. They have changed over time since they were first introduced in 2018. But you can see that for the main residential transaction, the main rates, then actually for lower band properties, there isn't a charge up until £225,000. So that's the property value. Whereas for higher rates, then actually it starts at £40,000, but £40,000 up to 180,000, you'd still have that 5% charge to pay. Just to kind of explain it a little bit more, and I'll try and keep it very simple. The tax is calculated using what they call a progressive rate system. So the purchase price is almost divided across those different bands, and then each band is taxed at a different rate. So as an example, if you were buying a property at 300k, you wouldn't pay tax on the first 225 of that 300k, but you then have a 6% tax to pay on the 75k remaining. So your total tax liability would be 4,500. Just to illustrate the difference between buying as your main home or buying as a second property, if you were buying that same property at 300k, because of the different tax rates for the higher residential rate, you'd actually end up paying close to £20,000 in tax. The first of the graphs, and I'm going to try not do too many, kind of go too much into the stats all the time, but this really shows how the tax due, so the tax collected by all residential transactions has changed over time. So when it first came in 2018, there was a total of £146 million collected in that financial year, or due in that financial year. Last financial year, that had gone up to 257 million. So that's partly because the number of transactions have changed, and also because the rates at which of tax that people have to pay has changed. The orange at the top of those purple bars is the higher rate transactions, and we can see that although the bars have gone up and down, generally the proportion of higher rate transactions has remained fairly similar. What we can also do from the data is look at what chunks of properties are giving us what level of tax, if that makes sense. So you can see the dark purples at the bottom are our lower end properties, up to and including 180k. Those have generally gone down over time in terms of the amount of tax they've given us. If we think that property prices have increased fairly considerably since 2018, so the number of properties coming through at that sort of value are probably less. Plus, we've seen differences in the tax rates as well. What we've done for the two taxes, so the transaction tax and the council tax premiums, is looked at what is going on elsewhere in the UK nations just to make some comparisons, and then started to pick up on some other people's research in terms of criticisms and opportunities. So land transaction tax, known as stamp duty in England and Northern Ireland still, and land and property transaction tax, I think I remember rightly, in Scotland. Generally, elsewhere in the UK, the thresholds at which tax is first payable is actually lower. So we're currently at that 225 or 180 in Wales, depending on the rate. In Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland, tax starts being paid at a lower rate of property value. We also seeing the higher rates are also in place for those second homes, but generally they tend to be flat rates rather than the scales that I've just shown you in the tables. And in the other nations, first-time buyers may be exempt from the equivalent to land transaction tax, whereas they aren't in Wales. We believe that there's merit in exploring these differences more, and particularly I was thinking because Welsh property values alone are known to be in that lower end of the scale in terms of the nations. It's interesting that actually our thresholds are higher in terms of where tax is payable. In terms of criticisms and opportunities, around stamp duty, there's this criticism that actually there are regional inequalities in how much tax is being paid. So higher value properties in London and the South East, those markets are contributing more to the overall income through stamp duty. You can also see spurs in the market when you're starting to think about changing rates. I can remember when we were looking to purchase as first-time buyers and seeing that either first-time buyers weren't going to be exempt anymore or the lower threshold level was changing. So actually, changes in the rates can impact on market behaviour. They can be a tool to restrict investment purchases and also to consequently boost home ownership. And in England, there's certainly discussion about scrapping stamp duty and bringing in the capital gain system. We need to remember if we ever had that discussion in Wales, that actually capital gains sits with HMRC, whereas land transaction tax sits with Welsh Government. So we're in a slightly different place because of the devolved nature. I'm going to move on to council tax premiums now. I'm slightly more kind of aware of council tax premiums because I was an empty homes officer for a while, and this kind of concerns long-term empty homes. And I worked in a local authority at the point that council tax premiums started to come in. So the Housing Act 2014 gave powers to local authorities to charge extra council tax. So you've heard of council tax exemptions probably for long-term or for empty homes in certain circumstances. This is about extra council tax, and that is for long-term empty homes over 12 months and also for second homes. So it's a power, it's something local authorities can choose to do, but under the legislation they don't have to do. From the financial year 2017-18, the power was to charge 100% premium. So if you were at the full premium rate, you'd be charged your full council tax and 100% on top of that. So in effect, paying 200% council tax. From 2023-24, the power was introduced or increased, so you could charge a 300% premium. And local authorities can keep this additional income and are encouraged, it's not ring-fenced, but are encouraged to use it to meet local need. I've had all sorts of fun going through each local authority's website to find when council tax premiums came in, if they had. And council tax premiums are in place for all but one of the local authorities in Wales. Torfaen is still to introduce a premium for both empty dwellings and second homes. Blaenau Gwent will introduce one on second homes next year. That's already been passed. What is interesting is we very much have a rush of early adopters in kind of North Wales and Mid and West Wales. If you look at the authorities, Ceredigion, Digion, Flintshire, Isle of Anglesey, Pembrokeshire, Powys and Wrexham. Then we have a bit of a lull in the middle, and then when that power to charge 300% came in, we had a raft of other authorities making the decision to adopt the premiums. A few more graphs here. I will explain the first one because this can be a little bit confusing. Where there is an orange dot or little square, that is to represent a flat rate of premium charge. And in this case, it's for empty dwellings. So for example, Vale of Glamorgan, no, Isle of Anglesey charge 100% flat rate for empty dwellings as a premium. If, however, we take the example of Monmouthshire, Monmouthshire have a scaling rate depending on how long the property has been empty. So if it's been empty, for example, for 12 months, then it's 100% rate, and it might be after 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years that it's a 300% rate. So there's a real mixture of how that's been adopted. I've ordered the local authorities in terms of the number of dwellings charged. So that's the purple line running through. And from that, we can see that actually there's no direct correlation between local authorities reporting to have the most number of empty homes that they could be charging, maxing out and charging the maximum amount of premium. And actually those 300% premium charges are for some local authorities that are reporting lower numbers of dwellings. The main thing to say here is the data on the number of dwellings is only as good as local authority knowledge of individual empty dwellings. And again, as a former empty homes officer, the first place you would go to find out about empty homes in an area would be the council tax register. Principally, when you start charging, you get to understand what's in your market a lot more. Moving on to the same data for second homes. So again, you'll see we've got a similar graph with the dots and the bars. Only one local authority, Bridgend, has got that scaled version of the premium, which I'm not sure sits as I can understand why more local authorities go for that, just for the flat rate, because I think the Bridge End one is if it's been empty, if it's been a second home for a year, it's 200. If it's a second home for 3 years, then it's 300. I suppose second homes are a little bit more static in the market around that. There is a tiny bit more coalition as well between local authorities that report having more second homes, so Pembrokeshire, Gwynedd, and then charging the 100% premium. However, it's important to remember here that they could be charging the 300% premium. So actually, they're not particularly maxing out on the premium that they're able to charge. In terms of the total amount that is being collected, um, not all local authorities report the income that they get. However, we've been able to see for last financial year, of the ones that have reported, £49 million was collected across the two premiums. Gwynedd had the highest collection at 17.4 million, and Pembrokeshire was the next down at 12 million. In terms of comparisons and also criticisms and opportunities, Um, so England and Scotland both have similar systems around charging premiums. England is a little bit more prescriptive for its MTs, so it says how much could be charged at 100 at 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 10 years. England has only just brought in, and this surprised me, the charge for second homes. And I could just imagine the likes of the local authority of Cornwall being really excited about that. And again, it surprises me. In England as well, they also have the option to adopt for certain areas of the local authority rather than the local authority as a whole, which is interesting. In the Housing Scotland bill, which I believe has just been passed, that includes a provision for unlimited premiums for second homes and MTs. And in Northern Ireland, you learn something every day. There is no council tax system. Criticisms and opportunities. Some of you may have been aware of a loophole that existed in council tax premiums around second homes, where second homeowners were letting their property out for a minimum number of days and converting the property in effect to be a non-domestic rate property, so missing or taking it out of the council tax system. In 2022, there was an amendment that said the properties could only do that if they're let out for a minimum of 182 days. So that was Welsh Government kind of drawing an end to that loophole. And if you Google particularly second home premiums, you will see the wide ranging opinion of homeowners, particularly second homeowners, on having to pay additional council tax premiums. What we found and wanted to just point out is the lack of transparency, consistency on how the income is used, as well as a lack of consistency about how local authorities are choosing to adopt or not adopt the premiums. And a question has come to us is, although the premiums were introduced as a policy intent to take strategic action in the housing market around empty homes and second homes, have decisions been made more around raising additional income, particularly when the 300% came along and a lot more local authorities chose to adopt. And as I said, there are real opportunities to max out on the premiums, particularly around second homes, because no local authority appears to be charging that 300%. Stefan is going to give me a stern stare when I start to run out of time, so we're doing okay at the moment. Then we just go into total housing geekville about statistics, because when you start looking at these figures, you start thinking, oh, well, that tells us about that, and oh, what's going on over there? Well, if you're me, you do anyway, and Stefan is just as bad at getting very interested about all this. The main statistics that we've used either sit on Stats Wales, so they are the council tax statistics reported by local authorities to Welsh Government. The Welsh Revenue Authority also make quite detailed statistics available around land transaction tax. And that data can tell us a few new things which we don't think that we've heard before or seen evidence before around empty dwellings, second homes, and buy-to-lets. I'm going to give you a bit of a taster of these, but leave you with some things to kind of go and look at in the report. So, from the council tax data, we can look at the council tax banding of empty homes. Now, council tax banding, I think most of you will be aware, is pretty out of date. 2003, I think we're based on. So the actual values that are used for the council tax bands do not reflect the reality of our current housing market. However, they are a way of ordering properties. So the lowest band is still likely to be the lowest band, and the highest band. So what we can do from the council tax data is look at what bands chargeable empty dwellings sit in. And we can see from that that 49% of empty dwellings sit in the lower bands compared to 35% of all dwellings. And then lower percentages sit in the mid and higher bands. What this shows us is that actually we have a source of lower value, more affordable homes in those empty dwellings. It varies a lot between local authorities, and you'll see in the graph, kind of the top grey bar is kind of the higher value. We're not saying that there aren't higher value empty homes. However, empty homes are all individual and the action that you take to bring them back into use and incentivise them. But it is interesting to see that there is a stock of lower value properties that we could be doing something more constructive with in terms of our housing crisis. This all looks very similar, but it says second homes at the top because we can also do this analysis for second homes around council tax banding. Now, what this shows us is yes, we've got, and I pretty much expect that living in North Wales, that we've got higher bands of second homes or higher percentages second homes which are in those higher band, higher value properties. However, 84% of second homes are in the low or mid bands. And if you think about the types of properties we're talking about, they're the types of properties that local households looking to buy their own homes on medium to low incomes would be looking at. So it suggests or confirms that there is an element of competition between second homeowners and local households looking to buy their own home. Again, this varies quite considerably between local authority area, and I will leave those who are interested in that level of detail to go and look further at what the graphs in the report say. Then the other really interesting piece of data, which has only really just come out, is that the Welsh Revenue Authority have included, since July 2023, an additional question in the land transaction tax return. And this is around the intent of the purchase. Why was the property being bought? And this includes, I am buying the property because it's going to be my second home, or I am buying the property because I want it to be a buy-to-let property. And that's where we start to get a little bit interested in what it might say to us. The first thing it says is in terms of the proportion of these transactions, so the proportion of properties being bought as second homes. Over the 2 years that we've got this information, they've gone down a little bit from 7% to 6%. However, and I will refer you to the local authority graph at this point, we can see that there's a huge difference where some local authorities are seeing quite considerable decreases and some local authorities are seeing quite considerable increases. This data is new and some of the numbers are small, but it starts to appear that some of the local authorities, such as Anglesey, Gwynedd, who have taken that harder policy action against second homes, are starting to see 19%, 17% decreases in these property purchases with the intent of being a second home. However, we can also see the green percentages where there are certain local authorities, which, if you got them on a map, might neighbour some of those other ones, which are starting to see increases. Denbighshire and Powys particularly spring up on the graph to me. So we can say, or we can assume from the data, or that it appears that local authority areas that have taken the greatest action to regulate second homes are starting to see the numbers either come down or stabilise. But we put a note of caution that we might start to be seeing some displacement into other local authority areas. This is my final graph, you'll probably be pleased to know. The same data we can use around buy-to-let purchases, so properties that have been bought with the intent of being a buy-to-let property. Now, anybody close to the housing system will have heard the churn of the private rented sector, the lack of confidence by landlords, the concern that landlords may be leaving the sector because of greater regulation through legislation and all sorts of other things going on in the private rented sector. We can see from the proportion of residential purchases for buy-to-let that actually between July 23 and June 25, the proportion of purchases remained at 9% of all purchases going on. So the data kind of suggests that there is no waning of interest to purchase buy-to-let dwellings. That isn't telling us how many landlords are choosing to sell their property, existing landlords, but you would suggest that if there had been a total loss of confidence in becoming a buy-to-let landlord or buying more properties as an existing landlord, that we would be seeing that percentage come down quite significantly. Again, looking at the different local authorities, there are huge differences, which I don't know the explanations for, and I hope that local authorities will be able to pick this up and do something with it. But the likes of Wrexham, Denbighshire, Ceredigion have seen some quite big drops in the number of purchases for buy-to-let, whereas other local authorities have seen quite sizable increases. I promise that that was my last graph. And my voice is starting to go now, so that's good. Other conclusions that we can make, I mean, I kept saying to you, there are clear variations in local housing markets across Wales and the need for local authorities to be able to have powers to do things at a local level. But we do think there's opportunities for taxation powers to shape Wales's housing market more strategically. It doesn't feel how kind of local authorities are kind of dripped on to the premiums, that it feels like there could be more conversation around that. And we're also keen to kind of make the point of the large number of homes not being used as primary dwellings that could be more effectively helping to address Wales's housing crisis. In terms of future work, we will take some of these stats to do our next report, which is going to focus more on the potential for existing dwellings to be used to boost the supply of social homes. So social landlords purchasing properties to become a social rented property. We've done some work on this in the past, but exploring it a lot further. And then also subject to funding, we'd love to delve into this tax data a little bit more and start to really make some recommendations for Welsh Government about how greater use could be used to influence the housing system. And that is me, and I've said time for questions, so I will hand over to Stefan at that point.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you everyone for joining us for that as well. I can see we've had a couple of questions through already. So if anyone else has any questions, please type them in. We've got 10 minutes, 15 minutes then to take those. Whilst I give time for people to type in their questions, I just had one maybe to kick us off, Wendy. And as you said, you've been pouring through loads of data as part of working on this. What took you by surprise, I guess? Was there anything there that surprised you, or that you weren't expecting to see as you were looking at the data?
I think the wealth of data, if I've got to be honest. And actually, not just for this report, but when we've been doing reports around homelessness, temporary accommodation, the wealth of data that is collected by Welsh Government and held by Welsh Government and on those websites, that actually, as practitioners in local authorities, the people that need that data probably don't have the time to really delve into it. And actually, it's told us some quite interesting new insights about the housing market, but the data isn't new. It's just the way that we've explored it.
Yeah, and it struck me as well about how you touched on there about what's been going on in the private rental sector. A lot of that discussion has been had based on feelings that people have had
Yes,
possibly about what's going on. And actually, there was this really rich source of data that was available for us all along that we could have been having a look at
yes,
possibly. And now that we know that, hopefully we can have more informed discussions in future when it comes to how we regulate the sector, how do we make it work more effectively, etc. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Um, I've got a couple of questions that are kind of related. So maybe I'll take the first one first. So there's been a lot of talk in England about the need to reform stamp duty, and that's something you touched on. Do you think there would be opportunities to do something similar in Wales?
so we have the power to reform land transaction tax how we want to in terms of the rates and the properties that are eligible. I think, as I said, and Stefan's been teaching me a lot about tax while we've been doing this as well, then actually, while we have, so it's talking about abolishing stamp duty and having something around in an income tax sort of way. The thing to remember as well, whereas land transaction tax is devolved with money coming to Welsh Government, then income tax sits with HMRC.
So income tax, part of income tax is devolved. Capital gains tax, however, isn't it?
My
Yes.
education continues.
No, yeah. So and it's the capital gains tax element, isn't it? That
Yeah.
isn't. Yeah. Um, yeah, so you're absolutely right, isn't it? There's a limit there to you can't Welsh government getting rid of land transaction tax. There's virtually no other mechanism at its disposal to was it
Yeah.
250 million that you mentioned, Bendy,
It's
that they came through it. So there's a very limited pool of other levers that you have at your disposal to replace
yes.
that.
I'd
Yeah,
really like to start to unpick the levels of tax that are being collected around those lower value properties which we don't currently tax, and whether we're missing opportunities there. And also those exemptions for first time buyers, which we don't currently have in place in Wales.
yeah, I think that's really interesting as well. That Wales has one of the cheapest housing markets in the UK, but actually has the highest threshold, at which point you start to pay tax. So there's interesting questions around that as well. Thanks, Wendy. There's two questions here that are related, I think, in terms of how big an opportunity do you think there is, kind of now that we've got this data, to try and boost the supply of housing, particular maybe social housing, and disincentivizing kind of second home ownership, so bringing back empty properties into use. What do you think of the opportunities for that from the data that we've now been able to access?
I'll start with second homes. I think we're not touching the sides of the maximum amount of premium that we could be charging in council tax around second homes. And even Gwynedd, where we know that there's planning regulations and different things that they've put in around second homes, they haven't maxed out at the 300% of premiums. So it feels like there really is more work to be done around second homes. I mean, Steph and I got very geeky about just how many second homes there are in Cardiff, which you would assume is not necessarily being a hotspot for second home ownership. So there's something to be done to really understand the data and how in local areas and how that can be maximised. Empty homes is always going to be a pet issue once you've been an empty homes officer. You cannot see one as you drive past. And again, whereas second homes is perhaps more of a political potato in terms of the backlash you may get, it's very difficult to see why we're not doing more to bring and incentivize empty homes coming back into use through the council tax system. Um, there are all sorts of issues around housing associations and local authorities purchasing existing properties, not just empty homes, to bring them into use as social homes, primarily around the standards and very high standards that social homes have as set by Welsh Government. So that we want to unpick in a future piece of work. Because actually, I think, was it 13,000 properties were reported? We've got 6,800, I'm going to say 6,200 households in temporary accommodation. How do you justify to those households, oh, we haven't got anywhere for you when you've got a wasted resource? I always think of it as house recycling in a way, that we need to be doing better with what we've got.
And I think the key point on that as well is that that's a minimum of empty resources as well, isn't it? Kind of one of the things that Wendy and I spent quite a bit of time talking about was that does Carmarthenshire have just a lot more empty homes than anywhere else, which feels unlikely? Or does it just have the better data about where the empty homes are in the local authority? So these are the questions that we haven't really been able to explore in this, but by actually being able to start having the data there is a point that we can start having those discussions. And yeah, can we get everyone to be as effective as possible in identifying the empty properties within their local authorities as well? Um, there was another question, actually, kind of probably builds on from that point, actually, in terms of saying, um, I know you said it's difficult to say what's going on in terms of some of the regional variations, but do you have any theories on some of the dynamics or anything that is particularly unexpected?
I wouldn't just say regional variations, I'd say local authority by local authority variation. The only way I could get any sense of kind of trends was perhaps the graphs look at local authorities by average house price in that local authority to start to see what's going on in terms of the particular housing markets. For me, probably the most surprising thing was seeing those number of second homes starting to push up in some new local authority areas. And actually, it makes total sense that that might be happening, but until we actually start to see some numbers. So I think that's something to really follow in future years as the data grows.
I think the other thing, and a chart that isn't in the presentation but is in the report, um, that I think is really interesting is around you've got data, haven't you, in terms of what tax band landlords buying the properties, you kind of how much they're paying for them through land transaction tax, and there are really, really big variations between authorities, aren't there? So somewhere like Cardiff, people buying the homes with the intention of renting it out are buying close to the average for what properties being sold in Cardiff are being sold for. Whereas in other parts of Wales, they're clearly buying much cheaper properties. And so they're buying cheap properties to rent out. And actually, that speaks to quite different rental markets developing in different parts of Wales, or not developing, maybe just a reflection of what's already been there, but we haven't had the ability to interrogate that before and have a look at it as well. So there's maybe we're learning new things about regional and local authority variations here because no one's been able to look at the data in this way before as well.
Definitely when local authorities are developing their housing strategies, this is the sort of kind of granular data that will be really, really useful for them. And it's something that, yes, Welsh Government need to be aware of, but in terms of knowing your markets and having the powers to do things at a local authority level. So I suppose we talk about making recommendations going forward for Welsh Government. There's probably as many recommendations for local government on what they could be doing with this data to work in a more strategic way.
So I think that probably brings us to a good place, unless I give a minute for people to bring any more questions in. But I think there's a real call to action there, Wendy. I think in terms of this data's there. We know that it exists. Yes, we've been able to go and do the analysis and publish it, but others can access this as well. And actually, this is a resource that we've probably all been guilty of overlooking and not making the most of. And it could really be helping us to inform and make a much more, yeah, effective use of how we use the housing market. I guess there's a question for you in terms of, if in the ideal world, if you had kind of, if we could go and do any piece of work that you wanted, Wendy, where next would you want to take this if money was no object and we had all the time to do anything that you wanted to do on it?
Um, I'd certainly like to be looking at land transaction tax, what's going on in the other nations. I believe we might be able to get the data around land transaction tax by local authority, which we haven't at the moment. We've only got intent. So actually to see that regional inequality stuff around where is the most tax being paid could be really interesting. I also like the idea that we've seen in England around premiums perhaps being or action being done at a much local level. So not just at a local authority level where we've got particular hotspots in the market. So yeah, I think there's lots of things that we've had to be really careful with this report and just present the data as much as we can, but it's got us thinking about lots of different things.
There's one last question that's come in, and we'll take this as the large question, and I think it's quite an interesting one. In terms of the bleed over you were talking there between local authorities, on second homes, for example. Is there a problem that the Welsh Government could be doing anything about at the strategic level across Wales to kind of challenge that, you think? You kind of reduce the potential for knock-on consequences, Or is it an inevitable consequence of having a localized system where local authorities are reflecting different political priorities within their councils, perhaps?
Yeah, so the question doesn't say if that's primarily around second homes or just people moving into adjacent areas more generally. I will leave people who are far better at kind of local development plans and strategic planning to talk about how local authorities talk about migration between different local authority areas and travel to work areas and all that sort of stuff. And that is looked at, I suppose, is the headline to say. Um, in terms of the bleed over from second homes, I suppose there could be markets that might be that could benefit from having more second homes potentially, and that's a very out there thing to say. But we've seen particular hotspots and the difficulties that that has created. But I know when I worked in local authority, then the discussion around premiums was the income that comes in from those homes. And Stefan and I have debated this a lot. Then actually, some local authorities may take a positive view of more second homes coming in. I think the main thing is, and perhaps we haven't discussed that much, is at the moment these almost like raw tools that can be used to take more strategic action in the market or to bring more revenue in. However, the one is counteractive to the other. So if you have a really high premium for empty homes, that'll bring more money in, but actually it'll mean that we get less empty homes, hopefully. So reducing the income over time. So there's a little bit of a mismatch and conflict going on there that needs to be talked about and decided upon.
Yeah. Thanks, Bendy. Yeah, and I think that's something might be a good point to end on is that kind of space, I think now, hopefully with this new data, to have a bit more of a conversation about kind of what's the strategic purpose of these tools. Is it purely to raise revenue? Or is it that actually the revenue we raise might go down over time, but actually we save money in other spaces because we're not paying for temporary accommodation, we're making housing market that work better for us. And I think that is something that's been missing in the conversation in Wales up until this point is how do we use our taxation powers to shape a housing system that works best for the people of Wales. So hopefully this afternoon's report really is a springboard for further discussions and to kick off work in that area. Um, with that said, I just want to say thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr, for everyone who has joined us today. As I said, the report is available online and a recording of this webinar will be available after. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll see you all again very, very soon. Diolch yn fawr.
Bye all.